I told her I wasn't in her hoe, and the way she reacted, you'd think I had just admitted to a crime. I was drenched in sweat, clutching a rake after hours of yard work, when this woman I had never seen before started yelling about bylaws as if she ruled the whole county. At first I thought she was simply mistaken, but the moment she sneered that people like you always cause problems, I knew it was something deeper than rules. There was a kind of hostility in her tone that didn't belong in a normal neighborhood dispute. All I had done was clean my yard, and suddenly I was the villain in her story. She actually called the cops on me, and I couldn't decide if I should laugh or brace for trouble. A few days later, I was working on my fence when Cynthia Cole appeared, dragging half the neighborhood behind her like some kind of parade. She jabbed a finger toward my lake and proudly announced, "Amenity right here," as if claiming it out loud would make it hers. I froze mid-hammer. My lake, my property, suddenly rebranded as community land for her hoe? For weeks, she had been bombarding me with letters about so-called violations, insisting that some newly drawn boundary had magically swept my ranch into their jurisdiction. The truth was, Cynthia didn't care about rules. She wanted my lake as a shiny selling point for her real estate listings. As president of Willowbrook Heights Ho, 3 years of power apparently wasn't enough for her. She stood there in neatly pressed khakis and a matching polo, clutching a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. "You need to follow community standards just like everyone else, Jack," she said in a sugary voice so fake it made my teeth hurt. I didn't even look up as I drove another nail into the post. "That's interesting, Cynthia, because I'm not in your hoe." The air shifted immediately. Her face turned red, her phone came out like it was a weapon, and within seconds she was calling 911 over a boundary dispute. The small crowd whispered among themselves. Tom Harris, a tall, wiry man who always backed Cynthia up, bobbed his head like a nodding dog, while Emily Reed lingered at the edge, quietly filming with her phone. Within 15 minutes, Deputy Carl Benson pulled into my driveway with his lights flashing. He looked exhausted, like he had already guessed this would be nothing but drama. Cynthia launched into her story, accusing me of refusing regulations and creating a hostile environment, painting me as some criminal mastermind instead of a guy fixing a fence. The deputy listened, but his expression said he'd seen this nonsense before. When he asked for proof of these supposed amendments that gave her control over my land, Cynthia stammered, saying the paperwork was still being processed. He gave her a look that cut through the performance and reminded her that 911 was for real emergencies, not ho-theatrics. She hated that. Her jaw tightened, but she couldn't argue. After the deputy left, the neighbors drifted away, whispering and unsure of what to believe. Cynthia lingered, her eyes sharp and calculating, and when our gazes met, she leaned closer and muttered, "Laws around here go through me." It wasn't loud enough for anyone else to hear, but I felt it like a direct threat. I had the county map in my pocket, the real proof of my boundaries, but I didn't pull it out yet. Something told me she had more schemes planned, and it was better to let her play her hand first. The next morning, I found a bright yellow citation taped to my gate, flapping in the wind like a flag of surrender. Dock and fence violations, it read, complete with case numbers and official language. For a moment, even I had to blink twice at how legitimate it looked. But I knew better. Cynthia had clearly spent her weekend cooking up fake paperwork, escalating the fight to the next level. By noon, she had scheduled an emergency home meeting to address what she now called the Jack Miller situation. Tom left me a voicemail, insisting I should attend to clear up misunderstandings, but I knew there was no misunderstanding, just a power grab. Still, I decided to show up with my documents, ready to defend myself. The memory of my father came back to me then, him carving a hickory handle for my fishing rod, telling me, "You'll come back here when you're tired of people pretending to be in charge." That sentence echoed louder each day as this madness grew. When I arrived at the community center that evening, the place was packed, way more crowded than any regular home meeting. Cynthia had set up a projector and official-looking slides about community expansion and shared resources, determined to make my land her victory. She had gone so far as to print programs for the meeting, as if this were some kind of theater production rather than a neighborhood dispute. I had to admit, she knew how to stage a performance. But beneath the surface of that little show, what I found in that cabin wasn't just silence, it was memory. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like something my father had built, a reminder of why this land mattered. Cynthia opened the meeting with a speech about maintaining unified standards across all properties that benefited from community amenities. The way she said benefited made it sound like she was bestowing a gift rather than trying to steal my lake. Then, with a click of her remote, an aerial photo of my property appeared on the screen. She claimed recent surveys showed my land fell within newly expanded community boundaries. The crowd murmured in agreement, treating her claim like a groundbreaking revelation instead of a blatant lie. I raised my hand to object, but she cut me off with a dismissive smile, saying there would be time for questions later. Slide after slide followed, each one building toward her grand finale. a proposal to make my lake an official HOA amenity. The audience nodded and whispered their approval, as if they were watching a captivating movie rather than swallowing a carefully packaged fraud. Her presentation was nothing but fabrications dressed up to look official, doctored boundary maps, forged signatures, even a fake timeline showing when this so-called expansion had taken effect. Twisted as it was, I had to admit she'd put serious effort into creating her fictional legal framework. When she finally opened the floor to questions, I stood and asked to see the original county records. She responded with a cold smile and some vague line about documents being processed through appropriate channels and available in due time. That was lawyer talk for her. I'm making this up and praying nobody checks. But then Emily Reed spoke from the back, phone in hand. She had been filming parts of the meeting and caught something Cynthia likely wished she hadn't exposed. On one slide about finances, Emily zoomed in on a glaring deficit in the maintenance fund. Suddenly, Cynthia's obsession with my lake made sense. She wasn't just power-hungry, she was desperate. Turning my property into an HOA amenity would attract buyers, raise fees, and cover their shortfall. I knew better than to argue further in front of her loyal audience, so the next morning I drove to the county office. A clerk who looked like she'd been there since the place was built pulled up the records and printed a fresh boundary map. Clear as day, my ranch sat outside Willowbrook Heights. She even joked about HOAs trying to claim land they had no business touching. As she filed my paperwork, she mentioned that desperate HOAs were becoming more aggressive lately, stretching rules to cover budget problems. Her words hit hard. Cynthia's move wasn't just about greed. It was survival for a sinking HOA. Outside in the parking lot, I spread the map across my truck hood and studied every line. My property was clearly separated by county-owned buffer land. Cynthia's claims had no legal ground, but her determination told me she wasn't going to stop. That evening, an anonymous email landed in my inbox with scanned copies of the original HOA contracts. They exposed exactly how Cynthia had altered documents to fit her narrative. Someone on the inside was feeding me information, but I couldn't tell if this mystery ally was saving me or setting me up for a bigger trap. 3 days later, Cynthia made her next move. Every resident received a thick packet in the mail labeled Updated Community Rule Amendments. According to her fake documents, my ranch was now an included lot. At first glance, the papers looked official, but I knew better. The margins were off, the spacing inconsistent. The whole thing looked like something spit out of a home printer trying too hard to look legitimate. She had borrowed real legal language, forged signatures, and even created fake reference codes. To an untrained eye, it looked convincing. To anyone familiar with real county records, it was laughable. I drove straight back to the county office. The clerk took one look and laughed. "Honey, this isn't how boundary changes work." She pulled out the original incorporation documents, showing exactly what land the HOA covered. My ranch wasn't on it. She explained the actual process, surveys, hearings, approvals from multiple agencies, and above all, my consent. You can't drag someone into an HOA by printing fake papers. In fact, most HOAs avoid boundary expansions because the legal process is too complicated. Cynthia's amendments weren't just fraudulent, they showed a complete ignorance of the law. The clerk even shared a folder of other disputes she'd seen. Many were from struggling communities trying to stretch their authority when debt piled up. One case about a shared access road hit close to home. It was eerily similar to what Emily had revealed about Willowbrook's financial deficit. Cynthia wasn't just inflating her ego or boosting property values. She was trying to patch a sinking ship by stealing my lake and turning it into a cash cow. This wasn't just about land. It was about survival, and she was willing to burn through every law and moral line to make it happen. That evening, another email from my anonymous insider landed in my inbox, this one carrying even more devastating evidence than before. Attached were 2 contracts, the altered version Cynthia had been parading around, and the original document it came from. Side by side, the differences were glaring. She had changed dates, rewritten property descriptions, and even forged signatures to justify her fabricated boundary expansion. When I saw it all laid out on my screen, I had to set my coffee down before spilling it across the keyboard. This wasn't just overreach anymore, it was outright criminal fraud. The email also included financial records that exposed the full extent of Willowbrook Heights' troubles. The HOA was drowning in debt, unpaid contractors, overdue equipment bills, and even what looked like a loan default. Their community pool was falling apart, landscaping budgets were 3 months behind, and residents were beginning to file formal complaints. Cynthia wasn't just driven by greed, she was scrambling for survival, desperate to conjure up revenue before the whole HOA collapsed. I spent the rest of the night buried in property law and HOA regulations, searching for what weapons she might try to use against me. The more I learned, the clearer it became. Her claims were baseless, but that didn't mean the fight would be easy. Even frivolous lawsuits could drain my savings. Lawyers cost money, and dragging me through legal hell might be part of her plan, make the battle so expensive that I'd eventually fold. But giving up wasn't an option. I had sacrificed too much, poured too many hours of sweat and work into this ranch, to let some clipboard tyrant steal it with fake paperwork. The next morning, I got an unexpected call from Tom Harris. His tone was uneasy, almost apologetic. He admitted that after Cynthia's presentation, he'd started doing some measuring of his own. "Your property line isn't where she says it is," he confessed. He seemed less certain about the expansion now, especially after watching how aggressively Cynthia was pushing it without proper proof. I thanked him, but a part of me couldn't shake the suspicion that Tom might have his own agenda. In neighborhood politics, loyalties shift like the wind, and even supposed allies sometimes just angle for the outcome that benefits them most. The anonymous emails gave me ammunition, but also left me with unsettling questions. Who was sending this information, and why? Were they really trying to help me, or was I being led into a larger trap? Sometimes the most dangerous gifts are the ones that arrive at exactly the right moment. Not long after, I came home from errands to a sight that made my blood run cold. A tow truck was hooked to my pickup, winching it onto the flatbed. A notice taped to the windshield claimed I had violated HOA parking rules on community property, except the community property in question was my own driveway, on land I held the deed to. For a second, I could only stare, stunned by the sheer audacity. The driver, a burly man in grease-stained coveralls, didn't look thrilled to be there. When I showed him my deed and the official county map, his demeanor changed immediately. "Look, man, I just go where they tell me," he said, already unhooking the chains. "If you got paperwork proving this is your land, I'm not taking your truck." He packed up his gear and drove off, probably wondering what kind of neighborhood mess he'd been dragged into. Later I learned Cynthia had called 3 different towing companies before finding one willing to play along. The first 2 had asked too many questions. This last one hadn't. But the intimidation wasn't over. Soon after, I noticed a pinewood birdhouse nailed to a tree near my dock. At first glance, it looked ordinary until I spotted a faint red blink inside the small hole. Surveillance. Someone wasn't just trying to enforce bogus rules anymore. They were watching me. Then, as if on cue, Deputy Carl Benson pulled into my driveway with his lights flashing. Cynthia had called 911 again, this time accusing me of threatening the tow driver and obstructing legitimate HOA enforcement. The deputy listened to both sides, studying the county map I handed him and comparing it to Cynthia's forged paperwork. His patience was visibly fraying. "Ma'am," he told her firmly, "false 911 calls can result in fines. This is the 3rd time you've dragged us out here for a property dispute that doesn't belong in emergency response." I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone and documented everything: photos, videos, notes. Paper trails beat anger, and I had a feeling I would need every scrap of evidence before this was over. Emily Reed was there too, recording the confrontation. Her camera caught something vital. Cynthia, flustered in front of the deputy, slipped up. She admitted her real motive wasn't about community standards at all. It was about boosting property values for her real estate business. That slip, captured on video, was priceless. Even Tom Harris, standing uneasily behind her, looked shaken. Another resident shifted uncomfortably, clearly beginning to doubt Cynthia's crusade. Deputy Benson handed her a citation and warned her bluntly. One more false emergency call, and the consequences would go beyond a fine. Cynthia had finally overplayed her hand. That night, as I replayed Emily's footage frame by frame, I knew I finally had undeniable proof of Cynthia's true intentions. This fight was far from over, but the balance had started to shift. The community was beginning to see through her lies. The question now wasn't if she would make another move. It was just how reckless and dangerous it would be when she did. Emily Reed was there too, filming parts of the tour and interviewing residents about their thoughts on the boundary dispute. Her footage gave weight to the truth, capturing how ordinary people could look at the facts and reach obvious conclusions about who was being honest. She asked careful questions about property rights and HOA authority, allowing residents to voice their doubts about Cynthia's increasingly aggressive tactics. If this ever went to court, that video evidence would be powerful. By Sunday evening, word had reached Cynthia about my impromptu community outreach, and she reacted exactly as I expected, through manipulation and fear-mongering. At the Monday HOA meeting, which I didn't attend but heard about later, she spun my ranch tours into a threat. "Jack wants to make the lake private," she warned the residents. "Who knows how much he'll charge for access next week? Today, it's free tours. Tomorrow, it's expensive permits and exclusive memberships." It was a clever tactic, feeding into people's fears of losing something they never legally had in the first place. Cynthia had a way of making residents feel like victims, twisting my openness into supposed proof of future greed. The logic was nonsense, but emotional manipulation rarely follows logical rules. Still, I learned through the neighborhood grapevine that several residents pushed back. They had seen the evidence with their own eyes, walked the property lines, compared the official documents with Cynthia's made-up boundaries. Her credibility was starting to crack, especially with residents who valued facts over fear. But she still had a base of supporters, those who preferred simple answers over complex truths, and who trusted authority figures more than their own judgment. That week, I sat down with Sarah Martinez, a lawyer who specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. She laid out 3 potential strategies. First, I could sue for defamation and harassment, seeking damages for the stress and costs of defending my property. Second, I could file for a restraining order to put an end to the fake citations and fraudulent claims. Third, I could investigate the financial angle, particularly the delinquent access road loan Patricia had mentioned. Sarah was most interested in that road situation. If the HOA is behind on payments for infrastructure tied to your lake, she said, there might be leverage here we haven't explored yet. Sometimes the best defense is understanding what your opponent really has to lose. She suggested finding out who held the loan and what might happen if the HOA defaulted completely. That financial pressure might explain Cynthia's desperation. I left her office with a clearer sense of my options, but also with doubts about whether I was prepared for the long, ugly fight ahead. Lawyers are expensive, even when you're in the right, and Cynthia seemed ready to escalate endlessly. For the first time, I wondered if I was in over my head, battling someone with deeper connections and resources than I'd realized. But giving up now felt worse than losing everything in a fight I should win. Meanwhile, the anonymous emails kept coming, each one more detailed than the last. The newest message included bank statements showing the HOA's maintenance fund deficit was far worse than I thought, riddled with expenses approved without proper board oversight. Cynthia had been bypassing normal procedures, making financial decisions on her own. The HOA's financial mess wasn't just negligence. It was poor oversight and questionable spending. Reading those documents, I began to see the bigger picture. Cynthia wasn't just trying to take my lake to boost her real estate ventures. She was trying to plug holes in a sinking ship, a financial crisis she herself had caused through years of mismanagement. The HOA was flirting with bankruptcy, and seizing my property as a community amenity was her desperate attempt to shift blame and find new revenue. Suddenly, her willingness to risk fraud charges made sense. But another question lingered. Who was feeding me this inside information? Whoever it was had access to confidential records. Either I had an ally determined to bring Cynthia down, or I was being used by someone with their own agenda. In neighborhood politics, the enemy of your enemy isn't always your friend. After my talk with Sarah, I dove into researching debt collection agencies and loan transfers. Tracking the details of the Access Road loan took days of digging through public records, county filings, and business directories. Finally, I discovered that the HOA's debt had been sold to a collection agency after multiple missed payments. That led me to a debt specialist who worked out of a strip mall office. Her desk was piled with folders of other people's financial failures, and she seemed surprised when I asked about buying the HOA's debt instead of trying to settle my own. Most people want to negotiate payment plans, she said, pulling up the file. You're the first who's ever asked to buy someone else's bad debt. She explained that the road loan had been sold off after 3 missed payments. The original amount was large, but her agency was willing to sell it for a fraction of the balance, just to get it off their books. According to the loan agreement, whoever owned the debt controlled the right to approve or deny access to the road. The HOA could use it only if they kept paying. If they defaulted, the creditor could demand full repayment or shut down access entirely. It was standard for infrastructure improvements, but it gave the debt holder serious leverage. When she asked why I wanted such a toxic loan, I shrugged and said, "Don't like being told I can't park on my own land." That was true enough without spilling the details about Cynthia. She left, admitting she'd seen plenty of HOA feuds turn into wars. The paperwork dragged on for 2 weeks, requiring notarizations, proof of income, bank statements, and references. It felt heavier than buying the ranch itself. But this wasn't just about defending what was mine anymore. It was about moving to a fence, seizing control of something that shaped the entire community. When I finally signed the documents, it felt like a chess game where I had just captured my opponent's queen without them even realizing it. The lake road was tied to this debt, and now I held the strings. If the HOA missed another payment, I had the power to demand full settlement or cut off their access entirely. It was a nuclear option, one I hoped I'd never have to use, but one Cynthia never saw coming. The specialist stamped the last page and slid it across the desk. Most buyers want quick recoveries, she said, but this one's been rotting on our books for months. They were eager to get rid of it, happy to have anyone take the burden off their books. I pressed the pen hard enough to leave grooves on the paper beneath. This wasn't just a signature on a financial contract. It was a purchase of leverage, a quiet claim to power over the very people who had been trying to push me off my own land. The collection agency practically begged me to take it. They handed over every scrap of documentation. The loan agreements, the payment history, even the legal clauses most people would skim past. That's where I found the real gem. The HOA wasn't just obligated to pay, they were required to maintain the access road to strict standards and cover liability insurance for accidents. In short, this asset gave me the authority to control their lifeline. By the time the paperwork was filed with the county, 3 weeks had passed. On paper, I now held the debt tied to the only road leading to the lake. The irony wasn't lost on me. Cynthia's crusade to seize my property had ended with me holding the keys, literally, to her community's most valuable asset. The timing was perfect. Their next installment was due in under 2 weeks, and they'd already missed 3. If they failed again, I could demand full repayment or restrict access altogether. Either way, I'd be negotiating from a position of absolute strength. I kept it to myself. No word to Tom Harris. No whispers to the neighbors. This was information too valuable to leak early. And Cynthia, I knew, was plotting something. She'd gone unusually quiet since the deputy's citation. That kind of silence meant regrouping, not surrender. But she was preparing her next move without realizing I had already outflanked her. That weekend, I sat on the porch, watching cars snake down the road with fishing poles and coolers. Families headed to a lake they didn't know was now at risk. Their HOA had been playing games with money they didn't have, and soon, the whole community would learn that. By Thursday, the reckoning arrived. The community center overflowed. Cars lined the streets. Neighbors lugged folding chairs, thermoses in hand, like they were attending a festival. Word had spread. Tonight's HOA meeting would settle everything. Cynthia had promised evidence, maps, experts, the grand finale to her campaign. She staged the room like a courtroom, complete with projector and microphone. Her supporters packed the front rows, nodding as she clicked through doctored slides and forged surveys. I let her talk, let her weave her lies deeper, recording them in front of dozens of witnesses. Sometimes the best strategy is letting your opponent build their own gallows. When she finally invited questions, I stood up. The murmurs hushed. Without a mic, my voice carried. "I don't have slides," I said, "but I do have something you'll want to see. First, the certified county map, my property, untouched by any HOA boundaries. Then, Emily's footage of Cynthia admitting her real motive, boosting her real estate listings." Gasps rippled through the room. Her own words, echoing through the sound system she'd set up. But I wasn't done. I laid out the final set of documents, the transfer of debt, the HOA's access road, 3 payments behind. As of Tuesday, legally mine. The silence was suffocating. Cynthia staggered back as if struck. Her mic screeched to the floor. "That's not possible," she whispered. But it was, and the notarized transfer papers proved it. Deputy Benson stepped forward, citation book in hand. "We've talked about this before," he said, his tone flat. "False reports, misuse of services, and now fraud." He handed her the ticket as residents erupted. Stories of petty fines, harassment, and intimidation spilled into the open. Cynthia's empire collapsed in minutes. Tom Harris apologized publicly for ever siding with her. Neighbors turned cold, comparing her fake maps to the certified ones in my hand. Emily recorded everything, every lie, every admission, every desperate denial. By the time the meeting ended, Cynthia was finished. Her reputation was shredded, her supporters scattered. And I, quietly, almost invisibly, had won. But as I packed up my papers, I realized the victory wasn't about maps or debt. It was about character. Cynthia had revealed hers, and so had the community. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't fighting alone. The next morning, the whole board convened an emergency session. By noon, Cynthia was gone. Her name erased from the leadership page, her chair left blank. She had fallen, and not just politically, completely. Still, I knew one thing. This fight wasn't just about her. And I wasn't finished. Not yet. Tom Harris was elected interim president with a clear mission: to repair the HOA's finances and rebuild trust in its leadership. His very first action was to issue a public apology to me on behalf of the entire HOA, officially declaring that every past citation and boundary claim against me had been invalid. At the same time, Deputy Benson kept his promise. He filed a detailed report exposing Cynthia's forged documents, false emergency calls, and harassment campaign. The district attorney's office began reviewing the evidence for possible criminal prosecution, while several residents moved forward with civil complaints. Cynthia's real estate license came under investigation, and her reputation, both in business and in the community, was ruined. Financially, the fallout was devastating. The HOA's insurance company refused to cover any costs tied to Cynthia's fraud, leaving the community to shoulder mounting legal bills and potential damage awards. On top of that, the original maintenance fund deficit was now compounded by attorney fees and the expense of replacing her as property manager. The most pressing issue, however, was the access road debt I now controlled. The HOA's next payment was due Monday, and they didn't have the money to make it. Tom Harris called me early Saturday morning, his voice weighed down with responsibility. "I know this whole situation spiraled out of control," he admitted. "We're hoping you might be willing to work with us on a payment plan to keep the road open for the community." Since Thursday night, I'd been wrestling with that exact question, balancing my legal rights against my moral obligations to neighbors who had no part in Cynthia's scheme. I had the power to shut down access entirely, bankrupting the HOA overnight. But that would punish innocent families who only wanted to swim, fish, and enjoy the lake. We met that afternoon at the community center, the same place where chaos had erupted 2 days earlier. Tom brought the new treasurer and 2 other board members, all looking like people who had inherited a disaster they never asked for. I arrived with my lawyer and a draft agreement I'd prepared. The terms were fair but firm. The HOA would make regular payments on the road debt, maintain the road to agreed standards, and follow clear rules for community use of the lake. "Here's what I'm willing to offer," I said, spreading the draft across the table. "Monthly payments instead of quarterly, fair fees for lake access that covered insurance and upkeep without burdening working families, and most importantly, zero tolerance for harassment, fake citations, or power grabs over my property." Tom Harris signed the agreement with visible relief. "I know we don't deserve this after everything that's happened," he said, shaking my hand. "But I want you to know most of us never supported Cynthia's tactics. We just didn't know enough to stand up to her." On Monday, Deputy Benson visited my ranch with an update. "The DA's office is filing multiple charges," he told me. "Fraud, harassment, filing false police reports, misuse of emergency services. She's looking at real fines and possibly jail time." He handed me a citation to deliver if I crossed paths with Cynthia, then added with satisfaction, "She'll have to follow actual laws now, not ones she invented." Slowly, the community settled into a new normal. Families used the lake under the new agreement, paying small fees that covered the essentials. The HOA shifted its focus to legitimate concerns like landscaping and pool repairs, staying firmly within its actual authority. Tom Harris proved himself to be a capable interim president, restoring transparency and stability to an HOA left broken by Cynthia's reign. As for me, I found myself in an unexpected position, holding the debt that gave me authority over community infrastructure I'd never wanted to control. The responsibility was heavier than I'd imagined, knowing my decisions affected dozens of families. And yet, there was irony in it all. Cynthia's attempt to trap me inside her HOA had backfired spectacularly. I wasn't in her HOA, but now she and every resident of Willowbrook Heights needed my permission to access the lake that had sparked the entire conflict. That evening, I sat on my porch watching cars pass along the access road. Families heading for fishing trips, barbecues, and quiet evenings by the water. For the first time in months, I felt peace. The lake mirrored the fading sunlight, calm, untouched by lawsuits or fabricated rules. Neighbors waved not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. And that simple, genuine moment meant more than any courtroom victory ever could. In the end, I realized something important. Boundaries only matter when they're built on honesty, not control. If you're still watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, consider hitting the thanks button below to support the channel. Stay steady, stay smart, and remember, if someone tries to draw a line across your land, make sure they're standing on the right side of it.